But before we get started, I just wanted to remind everyone that this is a closed mic session and it is being recorded. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll answer questions as we go along through this presentation, but we'll also have time at the end for additional questions. So some of you have already found that question area, so fantastic. We have hello from Twin Falls, Idaho. Hello, Inglewood, Florida. We have Candace is joining us from the Columbus Girls Academy. We have people joining us from Jarvis, am I saying that right? Jarvisburg, North Carolina. Glen Allen, Virginia is Ingers coming from us from Glen Allen, Virginia. We have Silsbee, Texas. More from Texas. Oh, we have somebody from Casson, Minnesota. Hi. I'm actually down here in Bloomington, Minnesota, so a fellow Minnesotan, love to see that. And then we also have Eric from Fayetteville, Arkansas. So welcome to everybody that did find that question. Oh, Madison, Wisconsin, fantastic. I love Madison. I'll just put that personal plug out there. I just love Madison. I have one of my best friends is a musician out there, so it's always fun to head out to Madison as well for me. So welcome to everybody who put their location into the box. We appreciate that. And it's great to know that everybody has found those questions as well. All right, we're going to get started with our webinar. Today's webinar presenter is the Reverend Jason Yarborough. Jason is the senior pastor of Monterey Bay Christian Center, superintendent of Real Life Christian School, and author of Building Strong Foundations. With a master's degree in school administration from Louisiana Baptist University and a second master's degree in leadership, which is in progress from William Jessup University in California, he has over 25 years of educational experience. So please join me in welcoming Jason.
Oh, thank you. It's a privilege to be here today. And I don't know, this time of year, usually seniors, I understand senioritis and that second master's degree she finished or mentioned. I got one class left, so I have massive senioritis trying to get that last class done. If you're going to welcome people in Madison, then I'm going to talk to folks in Twin Falls. I don't know if everybody knows where that is, but my dad was raised just down the road from you guys in Burley, Rupert, and the Malta area. So hello to Idaho. I'm very familiar with that area. I am very excited to present this information to you today. I've lived it for a lifetime. It's something that I started when I was just a little kid. My parents started a Christian school in our church, and I talk about that in the book that God privileged me to write, so I won't go into that today. But, private education, Christian education has been a part of my life for a very, very long time. And then turn my webcam here for just a minute so you can see who it is that you're talking to. I just moved to Seaside, California about 10 months ago. I had planted a church with my wife in the Fairfield, California area. We started a Christian school there, Fairfield Christian School. The church grew into 6 different campuses. And we have a second Christian school that we started at one of those campuses in Sacramento. And so that was my life. That was what I was doing. And then about a year ago now, I guess, God began to stir our hearts for something different. So we moved down here to the Seaside area. If you know where the Monterey Peninsula is, that's where we are. So it's really, really difficult to live here. But it's a wonderful place. We inherited a K-8 Christian school. I've always been associated with K-12 Christian schools. So this is my first time not having a high school around. So that's a little bit different for me. But quite honestly, we inherited a school in crisis. And so these principles that I'm talking about today are things that we literally have gone back to the drawing board and started implementing ourselves in our school here. So I'm very excited to share that with you today. As we get into this, she did mention the book that God privileged me to write. And I only show it to you so we can talk briefly about this concept of individualization. I believe individualization to be the most important component of Christian education. God created us all as individuals. We all understand that. We're glad that He deals with us as individuals. I have a slide here that I show people of my family, so you get a little sense of us. But even more importantly, and I always rhetorically ask this question, I've got 3 kids, they're all different, which one's normal? And those of us who have had the joy of parenting more than one child, we understand that that's a ludicrous question because they're all normal for them. Unfortunately, most education approaches kids as if they're the same and does what I call a cookie cutter approach to education, that one size fits all, that I just absolutely believe, does not fit all. My son there on the left, probably one of the smartest people I've ever met, but very even keeled, very not up or down. If Jordan comes in the room excited, something's going on. My middle daughter, or middle child, first daughter, which is right next to him there, you can tell that smile on her face. She's just a party looking for a place to happen. That's Kristen. She's wonderful, but very gifted in writing. And then there's, and my son, by the way, mathematics is just phenomenal for him. And then my youngest child there, my second daughter, Lauren, she's the deep thinker. She's the one that remembers everything you ever said and quotes it back to you at the most inopportune times. And they're all different, yet they're all completely normal for them. And that's where I believe this idea of individualization comes in. God sees us as individuals, so why don't we develop education as part of an individualized process? The Bible talks about in Jeremiah 1, verses 4 and 5, it says, I knew you before I formed you. God saw us before he ever created us. We know this. I knew you before I formed you in your mother's womb. Before you were born, I set you apart. New Testament, Matthew 10:31. And the very hairs on your head are all numbered these days. For me, I don't know about you, but that's less and less. So don't be afraid. You are more valuable to God than a whole flock of sparrows. And certainly I could probably spend a half an hour showing you all the scripture, or some more scripture, about us being individualized in God's sight. We're grateful for that. But I firmly believe we have to implement that in the educational setting. So what I want to do today, and we'll have some time for some Q&A at the end. And of course, Sheila can jump in at any time if you guys have got questions that you send to her. I want to talk to you about a couple of key principles, and then I want to jump into what I call 10 practical tips about how we can best use individualization in the classroom.
All right, Jason, before we move on, let's go ahead and launch our polls right now.
Yeah,
so
that'd be great.
We want to find out a little bit about the audience. So I'm going to go ahead and launch our poll first. Should pop up on your screen. So if you want to just answer that poll, are you a school administrator, teacher, or other staff member? So go ahead and click on that. Oh, people are voting. You guys are very quick here today. Very good students. I love when administrators and teachers are great students. We'll give that just a couple more seconds here. We have a lot of people still voting. All right, looks like our voting is slowing down a little bit. All right, let's close that and let's share that really quick. Sorry about that, Jason. All right, so for this question, we have 65% of those here today are administrators, with an equal split of teachers and other staff members at 18%. So that gives us a great idea of who is joining us today. And we had a late hello. So we have a hello from Nairobi, Kenya as well. So I just wanted to throw that in as we move on. All right, I have one more poll. See if I can, let's hide that poll quickly. And our next one right here, launching the second one. So our second poll is, has your school implemented AOP's Ignition curriculum? So go ahead and do that poll as well. Complete that poll. Either yes, full implementation. If you maybe partial implementation, even if that just includes maybe you just use it for summer school, or perhaps not yet, but you're considering for future use. We still have a few votes coming in, a few selections coming in here. The numbers keep changing, so I'll leave it open till I see them stop changing. All right, fantastic. Going to close that. I'm going to share the answer for that. So for that one, we have 41% on not yet, maybe considering for future use, a full implementation at 35% or partial at 24%. So it's a great number. We have about 59% of those here with us today that are at least using Ignition currently. So thank you for taking the time to do those polls, and I'll throw it right back to Jason.
All right. Those percentages actually are exciting to me. And let me just say a special thank you to those of you who are not current users, but you're considering it. It's a big step. I understand that. We've all been there at one point. So thank you for taking the time to at least check out the possibility of moving toward digital individualized instruction. Hopefully we'll give you something today that'll help you think. And I do want to say from the outset that this first principle that I want to talk about does not necessarily mean that you have to have everything all figured out. This idea that educators need to have a philosophical commitment to individualization. That does not mean you've got to have all the I's dotted, the T's crossed, everything figured out before it happens, because it's a learning process for all of us. But I've just found with working with schools over the years that if the administration and the staff is not committed, at least philosophically, to the concept that all children are created differently, that every child is going to need a little bit something different in the classroom, that we all learn different ways. All these things that we learn in school, but then tend to not, use in the classroom. If the philosophical commitment is there, then that makes things a whole lot easier, because you're not fighting the battle of, well, should we do this? It becomes more of a question of, okay, how are we going to do this? And that you can tweak along the way, and Alpha Omega is great at helping you with that. But this idea that settling in your spirit that God created each child differently, and we've got to provide for them the best education that we can. And a story that I share all the time is one of the questions that I ask brand new teachers who are wanting to come into our system, that are applying for a job. And I ask them specifically the question, are you a teacher who loves to teach? And almost always their face will light up and they will say, oh yes, absolutely. To which I will say something intentional like, well, then you may not fit in our school. And they always get surprised. And I tell them, look, I'm not looking for teachers who love to teach. I'm looking for teachers who love to help students learn. And there's a big difference, because teachers who just love to teach, it's that this is my way. This is how I run the classroom. This is how I teach. This is the method that I use. Here's how I do homework. Here's how, and certainly I understand the need for order in the classroom. I get all of that. But great teachers are the ones who adapt themselves to the student. And teachers will usually say something like, well, man, that's a lot of work. Yes. Yes, it is. That's why I believe teachers are the most underpaid profession in the history of forever, because of the effort it takes for a great teacher to reach every single child in that classroom. Me personally, I was a kid who excelled at tests. I excelled at written work. I love to write to this day. Obviously, I wrote a book. But I struggle with mechanical processes. I don't see blueprints really easily. You don't want me to try to fix your car. I'm not mechanical. I can do rough carpentry, but you don't want me finishing your cabinets. So does that make me deficient, or does that just make me different? And then the second principle, before we jump into the tips, number 2 is simply this. I believe that educators must have an unwavering goal to pursue mastery learning. And those are the 2 words that I talk about quite a bit, individualization and mastery learning. Mastery learning is an age-old concept. It's the way we did school in this country for decades, if not centuries. And it's simply the idea of making sure that a child masters something before they move on to the next, that they set a proper foundation. The Bible says line upon line, precept upon precept. And I think we all understand that repeating something is not the same thing as learning something. Just because you can quote it doesn't mean you understand it. I don't say this in any sense of arrogance, I took 48 history tests in high school. I got 44 perfect scores, straight A's. I graduated high school really knowing nothing about history, because I could memorize things at the drop of a hat. Many of you listening are probably like that. But it didn't mean I understood what I was doing or understood what I was reading. And that's the idea of mastery learning. It's the idea that knowledge plus application equals wisdom, that knowledge alone, is not enough. It's about helping these students build a solid foundation upon which their future education can be built. In research for my master's in educational administration, I ran across a statistic that I didn't believe was true, and I had to go back and research it, and sure enough, it is. The average adult in America after college will read 2 nonfiction books the rest of their life. And further study shows that it's usually those people that didn't have a solid foundation of learning, a solid foundation of a love for reading and education, that don't go on to continue growing and continue learning the rest of their adult life. So it's this idea of mastering learning. It's one thing to use a calculator. It's another thing to know why the numbers add up the way that they do. So individualization and mastery learning, if we ever meet in person, I'll probably talk about those two words. It's a big, big deal to me. But based on those two things, and let me share with you just quickly. I had a young man who came to us one of our years in school, and Michael was a 10th grader. He had failed algebra, had failed algebra as an 8th grader, had failed algebra as a 9th grader, and now was halfway through his sophomore year failing algebra again for the 3rd time. And when he came to us, long story short, we gave him a diagnostic test, the placement test we use through the Ignitia curriculum, and it helped us identify that he just struggled with basic fundamental math skills. And so we kind of hit pause on algebra. We went back and gave him a custom course where we taught him, fractions and percentages and decimals and all those things that kids need to really understand and master. And we spent probably 3 or 4 months drilling those things with him. When we took him back to algebra, he tested out of algebra in a day. It was never the X's and the Y's that were getting him. It was the fundamental math skills. So helping students build solid foundational concepts, mastery learning, which again is something that the Ignitia curriculum is so wonderful at helping us with. So with that foundation, let's jump into 10 practical tips on how I believe digital curriculum can be implemented for individual student success. And the first one is simply this: be willing to adjust curriculum pacing. Now, some of these that we're going to talk about are kind of sacred cows in education. We kind of have this idea that all students have to keep up with other students. Not true. Girls develop faster than boys. We see that. Boys hopefully eventually catch up. We see in our 6th grade here, I've got a 5'11" 6th grader. I have a 4'4" 6th grader. They're comical standing next to each other. Which one's normal? They're both growing at their own pace. They're both their own individuals. So be willing to adjust curriculum pacing. I believe that one of the fundamental flaws in traditional curriculum is that it tries to keep everyone perfectly aligned. It's just not always going to happen, right? You always have the tortoise and you always have the hare. You have everyone at a different speed. The tortoise, no matter how much you tell them to be a hare, is going to move at tortoise speed. It just is what it is. And they are that way to some extent because God created us differently. In our Fairfield campus school, we only introduce new education, new academics Monday through Thursday. So we kind of turn Friday off and make that almost a holiday as far as the Ignitia curriculum is concerned. And so we'll use Friday I call it blow something up day. It's our science lab day, it's fun day, it's project day, but it's also an extra day for those students who need that extra time to make up that extra work, because we're a brick and mortar school. And so we build in extra time for kids who need more time. Nothing wrong, just different. Not wrong, just different. Which leads us to number 2, be willing to adjust curriculum depth. Not every child is capable of doing the same amount of work. And some students are capable of doing more work than other kids and what would be deemed normal. And so since we know students aren't created equal, we have to believe them in why necessarily should their curriculum be. We have to be willing to allow it to contract or to expand. And that might differ on subject. You might have some students that are really great at English. Man, can they write? And so you want to turn on some extra projects. You want to increase something. You want to have them, I apologize for that, you want them to go deeper. You just have every desire for them to achieve everything that they possibly can. And so that's okay. And then you've got those students who absolutely, they're not going to get there. And maybe they really struggle in English. And so you've got to maybe turn off a couple of projects. You've got to turn that 500-word paper into a 250-word paper. And, I've had kids complain about that before. Well, why do I have to do extra? Because God created you that way, deal with it. We want them to achieve everything they can achieve. And then maybe they're advanced in English, but they struggle in math. And so you kind of pare back some of the math or maybe some of the science. But it's this idea of adjusting depth based on the individual abilities of the child, expanding for those who need the challenge and setting higher standards, but maybe limiting some things for those who struggle. Again, not bending to the conventional mindset that one size fits all. All right, tip number 3, be willing to adjust curriculum expectations. That simply means that outcomes are always going to be different. You're always going to have the A students. You're always going to have the C students. Now, if you have an A student who's getting C's, that's an issue. But if you have a C student who is doing everything they can, then let's celebrate their outcomes. One of the things you can do in Ignitia, and I realize that not everyone here is familiar with all the tools, but and certainly Sheila and the team can answer more questions for you specifically, but you can vary weightings. There's basically 4 components inside Ignitia. You have lessons and quizzes and tests and projects. And maybe for this student, you weight the lessons a little bit heavier because they struggle with tests, they have test anxiety. But maybe this child is more hands-on learner, so you weight the projects a little bit heavier because that's really where learning comes alive for them. That's okay. If a student's better hands-on, then adjust for it. Weight those projects higher. If they're not, then turn the weighting the other way. Increase expectations of quality where a student is able to excel, and lower expectations, if necessary, where a student sincerely struggles, not fake struggles, not as lazy, but sincerely struggles. One of the things you can do inside the Ignitia curriculum is you can block them from proceeding. So if a student fails, you can put a block there and you can say, okay, I want to make sure we talk about this before they just run through to the next lesson. You can vary how many times they get to repeat something before they block. There's so many tools there to help you vary curriculum expectations. Now at our school, we always do this in conjunction with the parents. We always tell them, hey, here's what we're thinking. You know your child better than us. Would this work? Do you think this is an acceptable standard? Sometimes you have those students who expect A's of a C student, and you got to help them understand that they're probably not going to get there. And then other times you do have those parents who have A students like, oh yeah, C's are fine. Like, no, we're going to raise that standard a little bit because your child shows that they're capable of it. So do it with parents, but be willing to adjust those curriculum expectations. All right, number 4, be willing to use multiple modalities. Now, this is going back to, College 101 for those of us who are privileged to get some training in education. A curriculum is just a tool. These folks at Alpha Omega, who are great friends of mine, I've known them for a while, they will tell you that their curriculum is just a tool. Don't let the curriculum drive all the instruction. If a student needs a different approach or a different angle, then give it to them. One of the cool things about Ignitia is you can bring in outside resources, which we'll get into in a moment with the multimedia tools. You can add things. You can, bring a focus to the kinesthetic side of things or the visual side or auditory. And actually the multimedia part of Ignitia, which we'll talk about in the next tip, they build a lot of that in for you. But the point simply is this: do what's best for the student, not for the teacher. If you want individuality to work in a digital environment, you have to sometimes cater to what's best for the student, even though it might be more difficult for the teacher. All right, number 5, which I just mentioned. So utilize Ignitia's built-in multimedia tools. Every year, this curriculum gets better. I've used it for many years now, even its predecessors. And every year we see it, it gets better. There's all kinds of instructional videos. I forget exactly how many Sheila could tell you, but there are thousands of videos and multimedia components built into the curriculum. All kinds of videos, these little things called tiny tutors. You've never seen those before, that pop up and give the kids a little insight when they need it. One of my favorite things is the dry labs and the science, especially for smaller schools that may not have all the microscopes and the chemicals and all those things. There's so many things that you can see and experience through the dry labs that are pretty awesome. Of course, there's games and that whole side of thing built into things as well. There's actual video footage from historical events and audio, and just there's so much there that helps a child do more than simply stare at a piece of paper or stare at a screen and read a few words and try to answer questions. So personally, I believe that one of Ignitia's biggest strengths, aside from immediate feedback and assessment and all those things, is the multimedia tools that are already there that normally teachers are out having to hunt down and find, and they're already built into the curriculum. So use those tools. They really help a child who struggles with that traditional reading, answer questions type of scenario. All right, number 6, be willing to use outside resources. Now, I mentioned a little bit earlier, custom courses. And I don't know if I'm still using the right terminology, but it's the idea that you can take the foundation of the Ignitia course and you can do whatever you want to with it. You can delete things, you can add things, you can rearrange things, you can put it in a different order, you can turn it upside down. I mean, there's so much you can do. But one of the coolest things is then you can go outside and bring other resources. Let's say you're a big, Khan Academy fan, which has been the craze in the last, several years. You can go out and find videos, find resources that your class really needs. Let's say you're teaching, 6th grade math, and for whatever reason, the majority of the kids are really struggling, whether you have an individual-based school or a traditional classroom school, and you say, okay, we're obviously struggling here. Let's go grab these resources and put it in the curriculum to give the kids another way to see this, another voice talking to them. Maybe they'll catch it a different way. Those of us that are parents understand that. We'll tell our kids something over and over and over and over again, and then someone else will say something to them like, hey, Mom, Dad, did you know? Yes, I've been telling you that for years. But they heard it from a different voice. They saw it from a different perspective. And all of a sudden, the light bulb goes off and it comes alive for them. So be willing to use those outside resources. It's not, I say it this way to our teachers, it's not the cardinal sin to use something not already in the curriculum. Alpha Omega completely understands that they cannot anticipate every single educational need of every single child who will ever use their curriculum. And while the curriculum is wonderful, sometimes you got to just tweak it a little bit. You got to go out and find something that's going to make it work for that one child who wasn't getting it the way that everybody else was. And I would even say under resources, this also includes incentives. This isn't just things you can add to the curriculum, but what can you do for a child to help motivate them to learn? What lights their fire? Which of course means as a teacher, you have to get to know them. You have to, find out what they like, what they don't like, what works for them, what doesn't work for them. And as you get to know kids, maybe it's, setting a reward. Hey, do this, 5 times and you're going to get this. Is that bribery? Yeah, maybe. But sometimes kids need that outside incentive because as well as I do, the average child does not see the benefit of school. They love recess and PE and they endure everything else for the most part. So how can we help them motivate themselves toward learning? Whatever you can do that obviously is reasonable and maybe even legal, whatever is reasonable, that's what you have to think about outside that box if you want to make individualized instruction work. I have one sister. Our motivations are completely different. I am the introvert. I am the one who is fun or happy just sitting in a corner reading a book, having a great time. I'm the one that walks into a room where there's a party, and I will be just fine, just observing everybody else and maybe talking occasionally and eating a little bit of food. My sister's exactly the opposite. She's the life of the party, or tries to be. She loves attention. And so to penalize me as a kid and say, okay, you're grounded, you can't go to that particular social event. Okay, that didn't do much for me. But for her, that was the end of the world. So find out what incentives, resources you have that will work for kids to motivate them to learn. That's another important part of resources. All right, tip number 7. And this is probably, in my opinion, as important as anything we're going to talk about today in these tips. Be willing to constantly evaluate. And I say it this way, one of the dangers of digital curriculum, and hear me clearly, I love Ignitia. I love digital curriculum. But one of the dangers of digital curriculum is it can make teachers lazy. They can simply exist with, okay, that kid got 80% on that lesson or whatever your threshold is. They passed, so let's just move on. Well, what about the stuff they didn't understand? What about those things that they didn't get? Maybe they were valuable. Maybe they were foundational, and that child's going to continue to struggle if they didn't pass. And so all of our teachers review it's definitely every test and quiz, and most lessons that our kids take to see where they miss things, to look for common themes, to make sure it's not things that they really need to understand and get right. That just because they passed it doesn't mean that they sufficiently learned what they needed to learn for that lesson. So constantly evaluating, teachers have to be proactive, in my opinion, to make digital curriculum work. But that's not a digital curriculum thing. That's an any curriculum thing. Constantly evaluating the work that you're getting back. One of the nice things about Ignitia, however, is that you get immediate assessment, which will lead us to the next tip in just a minute. But you find out right away, if you're looking, what a child got, what they didn't get, what they understood well, what they're still struggling with. It's this process of continual assessment that happens constantly in a designed digital environment like Ignitia has, that is certainly not in paper curriculum, and honestly is not in most of the digital curriculum that I've seen. this idea of continual assessment is absolutely vital. The curriculum cannot do the work. So what am I trying to say? If a child fails a lesson or a quiz, it's imperative that we don't let them just move on without interacting with them and finding out, okay, what didn't you know? What did you know? How can I help? How can I show you this in a different way so it'll be foundational for you later? If you take the time to make sure that students are understanding things at the lesson and the quiz level, they're not going to, for the most part, they're not going to fail tests because they've mastered the material that they need. So constant evaluation. And that is something that, Ignition makes so simple, because if a child fails a lesson, the teacher, depending on how you have it set up, your teacher can be immediately flagged, hey, this particular child failed this particular lesson. You need to interact with them and see what they missed and help them before they move on. That's done for lessons and quizzes and, of course, tests, which leads us really to number 8, which why do we do that? What's the purpose of that continual assessment? Well, it's so that we can take the time to reteach immediately. I think that we all would agree that we probably learn best in the moment when something is fresh in our minds. My dad tells a story about how they were leaving on a 2-week vacation, driving out of Idaho, going to see family in Arkansas. And literally less than an hour away from the house as they were leaving, him and his brother were arguing in the back, and apparently it didn't meet with my grandfather's approval. And so my grandfather said something to the effect of, when we get home, you're in trouble. Well, that was 2 weeks later. My dad says when he got home, he got in trouble, but he couldn't remember at the time what they'd even done. So it's this idea of reteaching immediately. Well, that moment is fresh in students' minds. They will learn best about what they did wrong when they remember what they just did. And as I mentioned, Ignitius tools give us incredible immediate feedback as to where a student struggles. And this concept I mentioned earlier of mastery learning, it depends on correcting wrong methods as quickly as possible. That's what the whole idea of reteaching immediately is about. And I love the feedback that Ignitia gives us, because the only reason that a teacher, and I've taught in a more conventional classroom, the only reason I could think of that a teacher wouldn't want to use these tools right away is just they've gotten accustomed to, grading papers 3 days later and giving kids back results and talking about it a week later. And you can do it in the moment. And one of the other cool things about Ignitia that kind of fits here is we do this every year with our standardized testing. And I'm not a massive fan of standardized testing, but we use it for multiple purposes. And one of those is to analyze if any of the custom courses we've created maybe are weak in some areas. So if we have, again, those 6th grade English students, if we see that 80% of them struggled in a certain place in that curriculum, then we'll jump back into the curriculum for the next year, and we will strengthen that. We'll add things to make that better, as well as it gives us a heads up. Okay, your 6th graders going into 7th grade struggled with this, so maybe we'll take part of our 7th grade curriculum right at the beginning, and we'll reteach some concepts from 6th grade, especially those areas where they struggled, so that they can move forward healthily in a good way in the 7th grade curriculum. So the immediate feedback, giving you the opportunity to reteach, is just a phenomenal way to leverage your success in digital curriculum. So would highly, highly, highly recommend that. All right, tip number 9. We're getting close to the end. Tip number 9, don't forget about good old-fashioned paper. And teachers everywhere are celebrating that I said that. My wife and I are different. I'm a Kindle guy. I don't carry around paper books anymore. Everything is digital for me, just about. My wife is exactly the opposite. She loves holding the book. She loves underlining, highlighting, writing notes in the margins. And it's totally fine. So don't forget about good old-fashioned paper. At our schools that I'm a part of, we require all of our students to have notebooks, and they are required to take handwritten notes. And we've got a few kids that for learning difficulty reasons will type their notes in Word or Notepad or something of that nature. But we require handwritten notes because we understand that it helps with synthesis of information, and that more than likely kids are going to get into an environment at some point, if they leave our school, go to another high school, or maybe the college they choose to go to, where not everything is going to be in the digital environment. So we want to help them learn how to synthesize information or write down notes. It isn't just verbatim every word that's on the piece of on the screen. which is why, for the most part, we don't allow our kids to print out their lessons. Now, if you do that, there's nothing wrong with that. You do what works best for you. But we found that kids just printing out lessons and highlighting is not the same as writing things down in their own words, which helps us know that they understood it. We still use some paper worksheets, say for extra drill in math. If a child is struggling, we'll send them home with things. And if you understand the science behind it, the different studies that are out there, the general consensus seems to be that people learn things 7 times faster by writing them down than they do typing them, because there's something that happens in that cognitive memory to that process. Now, I'm a typer, so maybe I don't know as much as I should. But so we use paper constantly. And one of the little things that we do in our school is we reward our students for taking their notes. Now, we do this, you certainly don't have to. We allow our students to use their written notes on their quizzes. And so if they've taken poor notes, then they're going to be penalized on their quiz. If they've taken great notes, then their quiz score is going to go up. Now, we generally don't allow that on a test, but that's just one little thing we do in some of our classes, excuse me, to reward students for taking good notes. That typing, that copy and paste just doesn't have quite the same value as writing things in your own words. So doing what you can to help students not only see it and hear it, but also write it down tends to make the digital curriculum much more productive for students, we have found. All right, which leads me then to number 10, kind of on the heels of that, which is you can't expect students to understand how to take notes. You got to teach note-taking skills. And, I don't really care whether it's Cornell, split page, they're drawing symbols, visual aids, not every note-taking system is best for everybody. I totally get that. I've got a person on my school staff that during staff meetings will sit there and draw and doodle. But I have found out that that's how they stay focused. That's how they concentrate. Because I'll ask them a question and they're jumping right into the conversation. They're listening. Yet I've got a couple others that I know if they're doodling that they're just totally zoned out. So it depends on what works for that individual child. But we have to teach them note-taking skills, because taking notes helps students concentrate on the material and not just letting that highlighted section that the computer's reading to you go by and then all of a sudden, it's over. And I think the biggest thing about note-taking is it helps students write things down in the way they understood them. I think we've all been taught that communication skill where we repeat something to the person who said, well, hey, what I heard you say was this. Is that what you said? To make sure that we're communicating on the same page. So note-taking skills, we believe, are a big, big deal in the digital environment. And we require it. It's not even an option. Our kids absolutely have to do that. Which leads me to one bonus tip, and we'll finish with this and then jump into some Q&A time if you've got questions. In the digital realm, one of the biggest criticisms, in fact, I'll talk to you honestly here for a minute. We're making the switch down here at my new school to Ignitia. And whereas both schools that I've started previously, we started digital from the ground up, here I'm trying to change an environment. And I've never had to do that before. I've always been privileged to create the environment, not have to change what's existed here for 37 years. And so switching over to digital curriculum, I would be lying if I said that I hadn't met with resistance, if I didn't think that we had parents who believe that we were just going to shove kids in front of a computer to be digitally babysat all day. And so I'm walking through many of your shoes, things that you administrators either have gone through or are going through if you're considering the switch in an existing school, because parents simply just, don't understand. And one of the biggest complaints that we have heard over the years is that, well, my kid doesn't learn well on a computer. And I always kind of laugh internally. Well, then how come your kid can stare at a video game for 3 hours and not even move and barely breathe? It's not the computer that's the issue. And so what we have found is it's typically the reading skills. Now, certainly there's other reasons. There's, auditory processing issues and, visual issues and all. I get all that. We've dealt with those. But 9 times out of 10, maybe even 99 times out of 100, when we get to the bottom of what's going on, why a student is struggling, it's because their reading skills are deficient. And certainly in the digital environment, even though you've got a ton of multimedia built into it, students have to read. And so every school I've ever been a part of, we have absolutely implemented a mandatory reading program. Now, again, you bring in resources, you bring in incentives, all those things that we do to try to reward students for reading. Even then, you've got students who don't want to read. So you might even have to scale the incentives differently for students who struggle, rather than trying to make it fair for everybody. You know, the life's not fair. God never promised us a fair life. So emphasizing reading skills, and I'm sure Sheila can tell you, there's some wonderful tools inside Ignitia where you can, you know, highlight passages and have it read to you, even in multiple languages. And that's wonderful, wonderful for students who struggle in reading. But that doesn't replace building their reading skills on the outside of the curriculum. And we've had success story after success story of students who, by helping them improve their reading skills, all of a sudden that digital world comes alive to them, and now they're having fun. Now they enjoy it. And so whatever systems you use, whatever you want to buy a system, do something in-house, however you choose to do that, we just highly, highly recommend doing everything you can to help your students become excellent readers. And just one final word before we jump into the Q&A, which I alluded to just a moment ago. I just want you administrators to know that, man, our prayers are with you. I understand now more than ever what it's like to walk a school through switching to that digital environment. I understand the mindset, not just of parents, but often the mindset of teachers that you're having to deal with. It doesn't mean they're not wonderful teachers, because usually they are, but it's something new. It's something that they've got to change. It's often they've got to change their whole philosophy of education, not to mention the tool side of it, the curriculum, the digital. And so if I could emphasize anything for you, it would be training, training, training. The more comfortable your teachers become with the digital curriculum, the more they become comfortable with how they can tweak it, how they can change it the way that they want to, obviously within your school culture and environment and academic philosophy. When teachers feel pigeonholed to a curriculum, they don't do well. But when teachers see the benefits of the entire Ignitia system and how they can customize that curriculum, all of a sudden that light goes off, and I've had teachers go from my enemies curriculum-wise to all of a sudden my biggest allies, because they see it. And so one thing that AOP, among many things that they do very, very well, is training. As this webinar that you're on right now, but they have, you know, nuts and bolts, hands-on, here's where you click, here's what you do. And so I would strongly emphasize, overtrain your teachers to the point that they're just, okay, I know all that now. Because if they're comfortable with it, the implementation inside your classroom is going to be so much simpler if you've already got the teachers on board. So with that, I will turn it back to Sheila for a time of Q&A. Thank you, Sheila.
You bet. Thank you so much, Jason. We have had some questions coming in, and I've been answering a few of them as they've been coming through to us. But if you do have questions, go ahead, use that chat to put your questions in. If you did want to use your microphone to ask Jason or myself a question, all you need to do is raise your hand, and I'll let you know that I will turn on your mic privileges. So a couple of the questions we had coming in was, how do we get the, about creating custom courses for those that are currently using Ignitia? You probably already know that you can create a custom assignment, a custom project, a custom quiz, or a complete custom course. We've had schools that have created a custom course for their onboarding process, where students are filling out their paperwork and the school rules and accepting their responsibilities as students. And so that's, there's just so many ideas out there of how people can use that. For those of you that would like a little bit more information, I just sent out a link, and I'll see if I can send it out in our chat as well. It's a YouTube video that we've created. It's only about 8 minutes long, but it really does give a really great overview of our custom course creator tool. Okay. Jason, we do have a question for you. Can you describe in a little bit more detail the reading programs you've employed at your schools?
I was trying to actually remember the name of the one we just switched to this year, and for whatever reason, it is escaping me. I would be glad to respond to that via email if you're doing a little bit of research. Obviously, there's the big one out there that everyone Accelerated Reader, I think, is one of them. But we switched to something different this year because our reading teachers that we have really wanted to try something different. So if you just do a simple Google search, you're going to find many options that are out there. But I'll tell you, honestly, the most productive thing that we have done, and this is age old, I mean, I did this when I was a kid. My grandmother tells stories like this, is Reading Buddies. We would actually, like currently this year, we have our 5th grade class paired up with our 2nd grade class as an example. And we carve out time a couple of times a week where the 5th graders come down and read with the 2nd graders. And having someone there who can help them in the moment that they don't understand a word, as opposed to the traditional, hey, read the book, take the test kind of thing. Having that one-on-one live coaching at the moment they need it, which of course is what we've been talking about today, that is where we have seen by far the largest increase, a leap forward in reading, is by pairing some of our students together. Now, not in the same classroom, so we didn't put like our strong 2nd grade readers with our weak 2nd grade readers, just a little bit too much peer pressure. But if they can look at someone as a big brother, big sister kind of thing, we have had tremendous success. I don't know if anybody else has, but we've had tremendous success with that type of structure in a reading program.
All right, fantastic. And I think you did a little bit of the answering for this one. But we have someone asking, Inger is asking, how would we reteach a concept to a child without them falling too far behind the rest of the group, especially when the child doesn't understand even after we've retaught the concept a few times?
Yeah, the first question that I would ask, and this is simply because I have made that mistake many, many times, is reteaching does not mean saying the same thing the same way. You know, if a child didn't understand something the first time, it could be they just missed it, they weren't paying attention, or something just ran by them. But usually it means because that way of teaching they didn't get. So I always encourage teachers to take a step back and try to find a different way to come at the problem, a different illustration, a different way of showing it to them, rather than just trying to say the same thing 2 or 3 times. Now, certainly, the more reteaching a child requires, the more risk you run of a child being behind. And that gets back to what we kind of talked about at the beginning with the pacing and especially the depth. It may be then that instead of that child doing 2 projects in the curriculum, you turn off one of them. It might be that you lower their threshold a little bit so they're still keeping up, but you also have the time to reteach them when necessary. So they're not behind, but they're still getting the extra attention that they need. So there's kind of multiple ways that you can come at that. But most importantly, we just never make sure that we try to never make our kids feel as if they're behind the rest of the class. So whatever we can do to kind of keep them on pace, even if it's raising that depth, not going quite as deep, turning off some things, changing some requirements, shortening the essay, whatever it is, maybe lowering the threshold so they can continue to move ahead with the class. But then that key teacher keeping track, but I still have got to work with that child, whether that's at breaks or recesses or staying after school, or on that, like for us, that Friday when we don't have new academic work. That's kind of all different ways that we have approached that problem.
All right, fantastic. We have another question as well. You noted that it is important to discuss lesson failure with a student before moving on. We currently use a curriculum where they must achieve 80% before moving on. How do you handle this at your school, and do you recommend repeating a unit to achieve a certain level of mastery?
Yeah, absolutely. I recommend repeating if mastery hasn't been obtained. The trick is finding out what is a reasonable percentage or a reasonable standard. I've got parents who want their kids' threshold to be set at 100%. Like, nope, we're not doing that. But I do have a few kids that under consultation with the parents, we've set that threshold at 90. I would tell you that the majority of our students are probably at 80 on the lessons, and our quizzes and tests get to be a little lower than that. And then I've got some students who are at that 70% threshold, and we even have a very small handful of students who, for learning difficulty issues, some autistic students or Asperger's syndrome, things of that nature, we actually lower that threshold to 60%. But regardless, that teacher is still making time to go back and go over the missed information with that child. Determining the place of where okay, when's a complete repeat versus just some reteaching? That's something that's got to be determined at the individual child level, because again, in my opinion, one size absolutely does not fit all.
All right, fantastic. And Roxanne, just so you know, in our Ignitia curriculum, you can actually change the threshold for individual students. So you might have your whole school set at 80%, but the threshold for maybe a particular student, if they're on an IEP or an ILP or something like that, you can actually change that individual student. And the nice thing about it, you can also go in and the teacher can just skip questions for them. So exactly the same thing that Jason was talking about, but in the Ignitia curriculum, it's super easy and really quick for a teacher to do. They don't have to print out new worksheets and, you know, cross out which ones they don't want them to do. They can actually pick the ones that will show that mastery knowledge from the student and then move on from there. Oh, we had a suggestion talking about reading again. Candace says that they've been using Reading Plus. For those of you that don't know, Reading Plus is an online reading solution. So she says that it starts at the level that the student is at and gives them exercises to help them level up, which of course is a gaming term. So most kids nowadays love that they get to level up. And she added the statistic, they've seen an increase of about 5 grade levels on the high school level. And so that's awesome. That's awesome progress made with that. And again, it goes right along with the support. It goes right along with what Jason was saying. You know, make sure that you're using multiple modalities when you're teaching to make sure you're really reaching every student and their learning style and their learning preferences. All right, do we have any more questions? All right, seeing no questions coming in, we actually have about 5 minutes before the top of the hour here. But seeing no more, that we don't have any more questions coming in at this time, you are welcome to go. I just want to thank you all once again for making the time to join us today. Please feel free to log out if you have questions, or if you did want to use your microphone to ask Jason a question, go ahead and raise your hand. Otherwise, I will just thank you once again. We appreciate the time commitment that you made to attend. We hope that we'll see you back next month. For those of you that are using Ignitia in our curriculum, we have a couple more webinars that will be rolling out here very quickly for May. They're already out there. And I just want to really say we so much appreciate your time. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We'll be sending a survey. There's a contact point in that survey as well. All right, Jason, any last words before we sign out today?
Just that I admire everyone who's taken the time to do this. Individualization is hard. So don't kid yourself that it's easy, because it's not. But the rewards are so worth it, both, you know, on this side of eternity as well as eternally. So thank you for the opportunity to speak a little bit into your lives today, and I pray God's richest blessings on your efforts in the future.
All right, fantastic. And with that, I'll say once again, thank you for joining us. And as always, everyone, make it a great day.